It's gonna start streaming shortly, and we are live. So, hello everybody. Well, it's gonna take a second. There's a bit of a delay, but hello everybody. My name is Peter, and this is Stacks and Facts. Here I am. And today with me is Elise Logan, author of so many excellent romance novels. Would you call them romance novels, though, or do you have a preferred term?
Yeah, I probably would, because to me, the big thing, different genres have different conventions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, romance novels is the key point, the relationship between the characters, and is the ending, do they find some sort of resolution for that? So I'm happy for now, happy ever after. If
Mm-hmm.
you have those two things, I think it counts as a romance.
Okay, excellent, excellent. When I was a wee child, unsurprisingly, I spent a lot of time in a used bookstore.
Oh, yeah.
And my boss, the owner of the bookstore, Liz, I love you if you're watching. You're probably not, but someday you might. Called them bodice rippers, and I was like, oh, that seems like a nice term. But figured I'd just clarify terms because that's what librarians do.
So I think, bodice ripper is one of those things that they associate with old school romance.
Okay.
Right? There was a whole chunk of time, and there's a really good chunk of scholarship around this, about how women used romance to sort of explore their sexuality within the weird confines that society puts on them.
Mm-hmm.
And bodice rippers sort of filled that niche in the 70s, early 80s, and you can tell that on the covers. Like, there's a lot of the sort of
bodices.
dubious consent stuff going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what people mostly associate with bodice rippers, is that dubious consent sort of thing.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Excellent. So, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So, I am a romance author, and also in my real life, a political science professor, which explains why my moniker for writing, Elise Logan, is not my actual name. And in fact, I have a couple of pen names, but the Elise Logan one is how I met Peter, and so that's what we're sticking with. It's also the one I'm published with Harlequin, so cool. It's probably the one most people would know. So I'm a political scientist in my regular, normal life, and I tend to do a lot of stuff on social media. I like it. I enjoy it. I'm a big advocate for romance. I think that romance does a lot, and I think it's important that people understand how useful and great the genre is. So, I mean, I don't know if there's not much to know about me. I mean, I'm married. I have a kid. She's a teenager. It's a little scary. Pretty much normal people things. So I don't think anything exciting.
Okay. Well,
I have cats.
Oh, cats are very important.
I have 3 cats currently, and the red hair and cats. Generally, I expect peasants with pitchforks at any minute, and sometimes my husband jokes that it's probably going to be weed whackers since we live in suburbia.
Oh yeah.
I live outside DC. My husband is a bureaucrat.
Oh, fun. I was actually just thinking, well, not just thinking, but I am considering a move for employment reasons. So we'll see.
I saw that.
Oh. But you brought up a point that I kind of wanted to pick at.
Sure.
So the idea of like romance novels and who they're for and why they're important. As a librarian, I am, of course, I think all writing is good writing. And I wanted to, because from our point of view, as an author, or as a librarian, the most important thing to us is that people are reading. Doesn't matter what, as long as they're reading. But one of the things that kind of occurred to me is the value of a good romance novel is you see yourself in it, just like any good fiction. And that's one of the reasons I was excited to talk to you about all of this, because consent is a thing, and people being happy and experiencing pleasure. These are things that matter. So one of the things I think is super great about romance as a community
is that as many problems as Romancelandia, which is kind of what we call the community, as Romancelandia has in terms of dealing with mainstream ideologies and mainstream concepts, romance is one of the genres where people are really able to experiment and try new things.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that romance tends to push boundaries, I think, faster than other genres do. Romance is one of those places where women can explore their sexuality, men can explore their sexuality, non-binary characters can explore their sexuality. People can look at different types of not only just, are you attracted to men? Are you attracted to women? Are you attracted to aliens with tentacles? We can figure that out in a romance novel.
Yeah.
You laugh, but there's, it's a whole thing. There's a whole set of concepts that we can explore in romance that can't really be done without that fantasy element. And I think that romance is one of those places where you've seen a lot of representation by the LGBTQ community, by people who are marginalized in other ways, that you see that in the romance community. And one of the things I think the romance community is good at doing is actually trying to work on that specifically. There are parts of the romance community that are terrible at that. And there was a huge blow up. You probably, it was all over every social media and everything around the romance writers of America around this issue. But I also think that that's a conversation that if we weren't in Romancelandia wouldn't be happening in the same way, in the same openness. I mean, Courtney Milan, who's a huge advocate for authors of color and for marginalized voices, was not willing to step aside for that. And I think that's fantastic, because that is a thing that allows us as a community of writers to really face societal change and societal development and look at it head on and deal with those issues. And so you've got Harlequin, which is a mainstream publisher, and they have lines that are specific to that are specifically looking for, can we talk about marginalized voices? Can we talk about alternate, not cis het kinds of sexualities in our books, and specifically look at those things? And, I don't know that that's necessarily a conversation that's had in a lot of genres. So it's nice for me. I love that about Romancelandia, and we all need to be better about it. I mean, we just do. And not having the conversations isn't a way to get better at it. So you have to have those conversations. It's one of the things I love about it. It's super great, in my opinion. And, anything that allows people to have control over something as basic as their own bodies, I think is great. And romance does a lot of work in that area, especially when you think about romance as a sort of genre separated from just pulp fiction. Really started to kind of come into its own in the late 60s, early 70s. And there's a whole lot of angst around women's sexuality and having control of their own bodies and having control of their own sexuality. And there's a lot of scholarship, I think I alluded to this before, about how that journey of gaining control over and agency over sexuality has sort of tracked in the romance. It lags. I mean, the romance community in terms of the writing tends to lag that, but it does track, and that's a really interesting thing.
Random anecdotal thing for those of you, a little bit of spoilers about me. So I'm queer, as most people I feel like at this point know. But one of the first moments where I even thought that would be a thing that would be possible was when I read The Mists of Avalon. And there's a scene all the way at I think it was all the way, I read it when I was like 12, which should tell you something about me, but where Arthur and Lancelot and Guinevere found themselves in a bedroom. And when I read that, I was like, oh.
That's a thing.
Oh. Huh. So, yeah. The magic of writing. Although I don't know that Mists of Avalon is necessarily what one would expect to be romance. Perhaps not so much. No,
but I mean, there's all kinds of strange overtones to Mists of Avalon. But
yeah, there are.
The writing is good. And anything that makes people ask questions is always, and I think, a good place to go. And
Yeah.
I think we've talked about before. I think that the the stuff
Mm-hmm.
I write sort of across a bunch of different genres of romance.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done some menage stuff, which is, multiple partners.
Yep. Yep.
I've done, I've done some same sex stuff. I've done some, some cishet stuff. It's, that's another thing I really like about the genre is I am not sort of buttonholed into one thing that I can write, and that's nice.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
nice.
So, speaking of questions, the first one that I wanted to get into, and interestingly, someone else asked in the chat, Ellen Theme, asks, "How did you get started writing?" Yeah.
Okay, so there's sort of two pieces to that. Like one piece is when did you start writing stuff just because you're writing stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
one of those is how did you started thinking about publishing those things.
Yes.
And it's funny that you mentioned this is Babylon at 12. I have a similar anecdote about Clan of the Cave Bear
Oh.
and Jean M. Owl, and then Valley of the Horses.
Mm-hmm.
And when Mammoth Hunters, I think, was being released, I was 9 and I had already read the books. And my mom hauled me off to meet Jean M. Owl at a book signing. The look on this poor woman's face when a 9-year-old is hauled in front of her to talk about these books, I feel badly for her.
Oh, mercy.
But I started reading romance, like my mother's romance books. And these
Mm-hmm.
were the sort of old school bodice rippers we were talking about. Lots of, Johanna Lindsay and Roberta Gellis, who I love Roberta Gellis, and I don't think she gets nearly enough love. She wrote the most amazing historicals with this like deep, intense research into history that I loved.
Mm-hmm.
And I was reading all of these when I was like 8 to 10 years old. So I was like immersed in it.
Mm-hmm.
And then crap happens in people's lives.
Yep.
And I found that I was writing as a teenager, like 15-ish is probably when I wrote my first manuscript, to deal with like just trauma crap.
Yeah.
The emotional trauma that we as individuals deal with as humans. And, some people journal. I wrote fiction.
Nice.
I wrote really crummy fiction at 15, but I wrote fiction. So I started writing as kind of a way to process and deal with that kind of different trauma and ways to deal with things.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just kind of kept doing it intermittently to deal with that. And my daughter just hiccuped in the background. Sorry about that.
That's fine.
So I started doing that to process trauma, and then it was sort of intermittent. Now, when did I start actually writing for publication is a different question, because I was working on my PhD and my dissertation,
Mm-hmm.
which is a whole other level of trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I had just had my child. And because for some reason I thought I'll have a child. It'll be a great time to write my dissertation. I won't be busy. That was a terrible plan. Don't do that.
Okay. Noted.
So I started writing fiction, and I had been sort of plugged into a couple, and I was like, you know what? Maybe I need to think about what I'm going to do with this.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I want to do a better job of this. I was terrible at writing, like the craft of it. The ideas, the plot has never been my problem.
Mm-hmm.
Voice has never been my problem. The actual craft of making your story function in terms of character arc and things like that, things that make it a readable, good story.
Yeah.
Those were places I struggled. And I got hooked into this community called Romance Divas.
Mm.
And it was such an amazing community of people, and they were like reading my stuff there. They encouraged me. They said, you should try and get this published.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay, I'll do that. And so I started thinking about it in terms of actually being able to publish it. And that community did so much to help me develop my writing skills, to develop my craft, to develop my voice, to develop the all of the skills you need to write a book. But more importantly, I think at that time, they helped me develop the skills to find where to get that story then published,
Mm-hmm.
how to write query letters,
Mm-hmm.
how to, yeah. So that's a big thing, is like, how do you write query letters? How do you do pitches? How do you do any of that kind of thing? How do you know what to do about an agent? Do you need an agent?
Mm-hmm.
What are the good matches for the way you write, for your stories?
Yeah.
All of that sort of nitty gritty business stuff, I
Mm-hmm.
had no clue on. Absolutely not.
Mm-hmm.
And that community really helped me do that. And it's funny because when the community sort of imploded and sort of disintegrated, I was like, this stinks. But I still talk to, on social media via Twitter mostly, a lot of the people who I met first in Divas.
Mm-hmm.
And I really value those connections because they really helped me understand how the publishing end of thing works.
Yeah.
End of things works. And I could not have done it
Mm-hmm.
if I hadn't had that mentorship
Yeah.
from these other authors. And some of them are now pretty big names. And so that's
Awesome.
pretty cool.
That's
It's really nice. But that's how I got into it.
Mm-hmm.
And then how I got into publishing it, which is a kind of different question.
A little bit, yeah, yeah, but that's okay.
Yeah.
I think all questions are good questions. So, since we're talking about romance novels and the process of writing, what actually goes into writing a romance novel? Like, do you have discrete steps that you follow, or
Well, I
walk
mean,
us through?
process is one of those things that we joke about in Romancelandia all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Are you a pantser? Are you a plotter? You know, what kind of process do you follow? I personally am sort of a semi-plotter.
Okay.
If I don't know where I'm going, I'll wander off into the weeds and never come back. So I have to know kind of where I'm going. I
Yeah.
have to have some idea. So I tend to outline
Mm-hmm.
sort of in general blocks as to where I'm going to be going.
Yeah.
And then I write within those blocks.
Okay.
I use Scrivener to sort of organize my thoughts. I love Scrivener. I have a lot of author friends who hate Scrivener. They can't stand the chunkiness of it.
Okay.
So a lot of that depends on your personal style. I have friends who are pantsers. I have friends who plot everything down to the tiniest detail. So I think any process is good process.
Mm-hmm.
The things that I think are key components of romance, I think, are key components of any good story. I mentioned earlier that the things I think make it a romance are that the relationship between the characters, that romantic relationship, is a focus of the story.
Yeah.
And that at the end of that story, there is a happy for now or a happily ever after. It's kind of like I talk about, there's a difference between romantic elements. That is, there are romantic elements in the story. There's a love story.
Mm-hmm.
But it may not be a romance, because the romance really requires that happy for now or happy ever after ending.
Gotcha.
Because it's kind of like a mystery, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you were reading a cozy mystery and the mystery didn't get solved, you'd be mad.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just a genre convention.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's something that a lot of people in Romancelandia get really cranked about, is things being mislabeled as romance when they're not. I think that the sort of classic example of this is Nicholas Sparks, who absolutely hates to have happy endings. And so his books have romantic elements. They have love stories, but they are not romance because they don't have that happily ever after ending, or that happily for now ending. I think romance is one of those places where the genre is irrelevant in a lot of cases, because the love story is there and the happily ever after is what makes it a romance.
Yeah.
But there's romance all over the place, right? Sci-fi, fantasy, contemporary, historical, you name it, there's romance written in that.
Yeah.
So, that's kind of a key piece, is having that thing. And so the other stuff that makes a good romance is stuff that makes a good story. Is there good character development? Does the setting make sense? Does it hang together? is there a good plot arc? Is there, all of that? Does the author's voice make sense? Does the editing look good? Does all of those things that just make a good story is what makes a good romance. I mean, if it's not a good story, it's not going to be a good romance.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, and I appreciate the fact that like you mentioned the idea that it has to have that happily ever afterness, because like there's so many different things. Like no one would consider like the Mockingjay series to be romance novels, even though there is that element of romance, because you don't have that happy ending. It's not central to the plot. Like it's a string that goes along, but it's not primary to it. So
I mean, I think a similar discussion happens around the idea of Romeo and Juliet, right? Because Romeo and Juliet, the relationship is the key piece. It is the plot, right? Like that is the overarching thing. It's not a romance because they're dead at the end. Spoiler alert.
Yeah. If anyone hasn't read it yet, just so you know, sorry about that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a Shakespearean tragedy. People die. So that's what keeps, it's not a romance. It's a tragedy.
Exactly.
So that is a key point that I think defines the genre. Just like solving a mystery defines that you're in a mystery. There's genre conventions, right? And that's I think the defining one.
Yeah, cool. So another question we actually got from the same person, from Ellen, is, and this is kind of pulling the lens back, how do you feel about cultural perceptions of romance as a genre?
Well, I mean, they're annoying, because the cultural perception is so at odds with what we know about romance readers. The perception is that they're bodice rippery, that the people who are reading them are just uneducated, repressed housewives or something. And the numbers don't say that. The numbers actually show that romance readers are well educated, that they often are, people who have professional capabilities, who are holding down jobs, who are doing all kinds of stuff, that if they're housewives, and that's a totally valid profession, if they're housewives, they may have completely healthy and awesome relationships. There's nothing like the stereotype of what the romance reader looks like is kind of, it's annoying because stereotypes are generally annoying. A big chunk of the romance market is actually male, or identifies as male. It's not the hugest chunk, but there's a chunk there. Romance readers vary in age. There's not there's not a specific set, like it's only like 38 to 48-year-olds or something like that. It's across the spectrum. You have romance readers who are very young. I mean, I started reading them when I was like 8 or 9. And you have romance readers who are in their 80s and 90s. So that idea that there's this stereotypical reader is really frustrating to me. More importantly, it's super frustrating how badly all of the industry treats romance, when romance, by the numbers, sells more books, makes more money, gets more readers. Romance readers read more books each year than other genres of readers, by a long shot. They buy more books, they spend more money, and for publishing as a whole, and particularly the sort of scholarship community and the academia, to be so sort of looking down their nose at Romancelandia is very frustrating. We have a lot of very well-educated, very, very smart people in Romancelandia, and it's frustrating to see them and all of us be dismissed as fluffy and not important. And romance stories tell important stories. And it's frustrating. But it's also not a fight that I feel like I need to have every single day. Like if somebody wants to know and wants to learn, I am happy to talk to them about it. If they want to be dismissive and obnoxious, I have other fish to fry. I do not need to be spending my emotional currency on that. So, I
Yeah.
mean, I find it frustrating and
Mm-hmm.
upsetting and irritating,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but not to the extent that I will go out and find people to like educate about that and
Yeah.
proselytize.
Yeah, and from the perspective of libraries, at least at my library, like everything you said is what we see in terms of reading trends and purchasing trends. Like at our system, it's a big deal at the central branch, or at least big enough that we talk about it regularly. When the Harley shipment comes in, and we have so many people who come in and like they want the entire, well, they don't want the entire body of work of an author because they've already read it, but like they come in regularly and like, hey, has the new such and such book come out? When is this? When are you guys going to get this? Can I get an ebook copy of this? So yeah, and it's I guess it's a little similar to like in terms of how people talk about the snobbery of it. It's very similar to how people think of graphic novels and
I
comic
think that's
books.
accurate.
Like
Yeah.
people feel like it's not as good because there's pictures, for example, and it's not high literature, as it were. But that's bunk. Like the I've been reading a lot of graphic novels lately, and man, the quality of story in them is just
I mean, Shakespeare wasn't high literature when Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare.
yeah, yeah,
Chaucer wasn't high literature when Chaucer wrote Chaucer.
mm-hmm.
Right? When the Canterbury Tales were written, they were considered to be pulp. And, now they are canon.
Yeah.
So there you go.
There you go. So another question, since we've got a bunch in the chat, this is very exciting. So Althena, one of my good friends, asks, related to that first question, have you had people look down? Oh, well, we just answered that. Have you had people look down on you or your genre because of it? So
Sure.
go to the next one.
I'll actually, can I hit on that for a
Yeah,
second?
go
Because
ahead.
that's a thing about pen names, right? Like a
Mm-hmm.
lot of romance authors use pen names
Yeah.
for exactly this reason,
Mm-hmm.
because we have professional lives.
Yeah.
And I don't want people like hunting for my professionally published articles
Yeah.
and getting some crossover and confusion.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of people who, for personal reasons or professional reasons, use pen names. Like you may have family who has real concerns about people writing about sex.
Mm-hmm.
You may have an employer who is particularly stodgy about that sort of thing. And
Yeah.
that's a really big thing in the romance community, is that we use a lot of pen names, and we get a lot of flack for the same reasons of,
Mm-hmm.
well, if you were proud of your work, you would use your regular name. And it's like, yeah, well, except for the fact that reality is a thing,
Yeah.
and we all have to also make money, because spoiler alert, sorry for anybody who's an aspiring author, the likelihood you're going to make enough to support yourself being an author is not great.
Mm-hmm.
So you need a day job.
Yeah.
And so pen names are helpful.
Yeah. And Ellen brings up the good point of, so she says, I feel like in a weird way, more people can identify with the genre conventions of romance because there's just so much discussion around it. Or maybe Jane the Virgin did that. Don't know. In parentheses. Yeah, and that was the thing that I thought was interesting, is when I sat down and properly read a romance novel all the way through. By the way, it was yours. It was Twice as High, and I loved it. The first one I read.
Glad you.
Yeah, like, I wish more people understood that it's not so formulaic. It's writing that also happens to involve these other things, like you were talking about. Like, you still have to have that good structure and the good writing conventions, and it is a craft, which I think leads us to an excellent segue of, let's talk about self-publishing versus conventional publishing.
Yeah.
Because if we're going to talk about perceptions of quality of publishing, let's...
Oh, big time. And
Yeah.
this is a place where it's really interesting, because self-publishing is in some ways the Wild West of publishing.
Mm-hmm.
There are so few rules around it, and it is what you make it, which is, I think, both a pro and a con.
Mm-hmm.
From a reader perspective, self-published stuff it's always a roll of the dice. You don't know what you're going to get. You don't know how good the editing is. You don't know how good the formatting is. You don't know what you're going to get when you get into that book. And the benefit to doing something that is traditionally published is that you are theoretically guaranteed a certain level of editing and professional sort of production value in the book, which makes it easier to read, a lot easier to read. Mm-hmm. Editing is super important. I cannot emphasize how important good editing is.
Yeah.
And that's a thing that when you're self-publishing, you have to take on yourself. You have to find a good editor. Mm-hmm. You have to find, and if you have to know yourself, you have to be really, really honest with yourself. You have to be like, okay, do I need a content editor? Am I the kind of writer who, because I do pantsing or because I've changed some things about the stories, I may not have caught all of the content, all of the like continuity stuff. I need somebody who's going to read for continuity. Everybody needs a line editor. Mm-hmm. Everybody needs a line editor. I don't care how experienced or how good you are. A good line editor is absolutely essential. No matter how many books you've published, and you can tell when somebody doesn't have a line editor. And so the fact that you have to take that on yourself, mm-hmm. And when you're doing self-publishing, you have to take on the editing, you have to take on the cover art, you have to take on the publicity. All of that is your responsibility. Mm-hmm. On the good side of that, it's all your responsibility. You have complete control.
Yeah.
But it also means you have complete responsibility for the budget and the production.
Yeah.
So that's the biggest downside. It's mm-hmm. just how much of that weight is on you financially and emotionally.
Yeah.
And that's a thing that when you traditionally publish, all of that weight is then on the publishing house. Mm-hmm. And they often have people who are, because they're doing multiple clients and doing lots of things, there's an economy of scale that goes with that, that allows them to have better production value for the cost mm-hmm. than you could get.
Yeah.
So that's a sort of a trade-off that you're making. One of the big things that made me choose to self-publish a number of things and choose not to self-publish others is actually, what is the story? Mm. Is this something, because the publishing houses are looking for what's going to sell for them.
Yeah.
How is that commercially viable? Do they think they can sell? So the stuff that I have that's much more sort of mainstream, I think like the one that like Menage on 34th Street is an example of that. Even though it's a menage, it's a pretty straightforward one. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have any like strange things going on. And like, I can tell you that I pitched a story to a mainstream publisher that was a off mainstream kind of idea. And they were like, nope, we don't have any confidence we can sell that. Mm. And then we published it as a self-published novel, and it did much better than anything else that we had done. And was super fun. But I should probably take a minute here to tell them something that I told you, which is I have pulled basically my entire back catalog mm-hmm. of stuff that's not at Harlequin, because I'm in charge of editing and mm-hmm. all of that stuff. The editing conventions and formatting conventions have changed in the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. And so I made the decision last year, at the end of last year, to just go ahead and pull everything, re-edit it, repackage it, and put it back up. Mm-hmm. I've gotten sort of sidetracked with events of the world.
What? No.
Yeah.
What could be going on that could sidetrack you from such a very simple process, I'm sure?
Nothing important. It's fine. So it's not back up. But so one of the things is I wrote a story with the same writing partner that Menage on 34th was written with, mm-hmm. and it was a Christmas story. Mm-hmm. And it involved, it's called More Than a Man. Mm-hmm. And some people may have written it. And it involved the idea of what would happen if, this is in the far future, right. if you had a society who could design their perfect man, right? Okay. So she can go in and order her perfect guy. But what happens if there's a mistake and you accidentally cross your Christmas list, your dad's gingerbread cookie recipe, and the perfect man list? What happens then? And the answer is, well, you get a guy who can create licorice tentacles where the buttons would be on a and his and his ejaculate tastes like frosting.
I mean, of course.
Sure.
Of course.
But I mean, it was a completely silly, ridiculous idea. And it was so much fun to write. Mm-hmm. But also, actually, there's a lot of moral weight in that. Mm-hmm. If you can here's the thing. You've just designed your perfect guy, but it's not what you designed. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So now you have this living, breathing, actual, fully realized person who isn't what you ordered. Do you return it? What happens to the returns?
Yeah. Yeah.
What's the moral weight that goes with like there's a lot of moral weight that goes with that people don't necessarily think about, that you can explore in lighthearted and different ways in terms of what happens if somebody doesn't meet the formula or the norm of your society, and how do you deal with that? And it was an interesting way to be able to deal with that. But we were told nobody would buy it. People bought it. It was great.
Yeah. For those of you just joining us, Elise was just telling us about the excellent concept for a novel where you accidentally cross a recipe for gingerbread men with the recipe for the perfect man, and the delicious results that come from that.
It was craziness, but the idea was that was not something that traditional publishing was interested in taking on.
Right.
So it was something we had to do, self-published.
Yeah.
And so you can take risks in self-publishing you would never be able to take in traditional publishing. Yeah. So in terms of pros and cons, it depends on what your story is and how much work of that story you want to do.
Yep.
And how much control you feel like you need to have. Like some people are just really into the idea of controlling every step of the process. And for them, traditional publishing is never going to be a good match. No matter how good, how much they publish, doesn't matter. They're never going to be a good match for traditional publishing.
Yeah.
And for some people, they want to write and then not do any of the other stuff. Like, I just want to do the writing. And those people are not going to be a good match for self-publishing. Yeah. And then you have people like me who are sort of all over the board. And so some things go to self-publishing and some things go to traditional publishing. And there are a lot of us who do what's called hybrid careers of doing some traditionally published and some self-published. That's pretty common. I think probably one of the best known ones who does that is Ilona Andrews, who's fantastic. Highly recommend the Ilona Andrews book. That's actually a husband-wife writing team. And they have fantastic series that are traditionally published. The Kate Daniels series, and they have some. That is a fantastic series, and they traditionally publish those, but they self-publish their Innkeeper Chronicles, which are also fantastic books. And I think their Kinsman series is also only self-published. So they've got sort of the hybrid career going on. And romance is one of those places where I think that hybrid career is just accepted as normal. Like, sure, of course you have a hybrid career. It's fine. And nobody even questions that. No. And I think there are other genres where there is a lot more stigma around self-publishing than there is for romance. And I think that stems from the earlier discussion we were having about the fact that so much of academia and society kind of looks down its nose at romance. We're like, whatever, we're used to people just sort of poo-pooing our stuff.
Yeah.
It's nothing new to us. So I feel like it's that same kind of mentality that allows romance to be a little more experimental than it might otherwise be.
Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah.
So one more question from the audience before we move on to the meat and potatoes of the discussion, as it were. Ellen asks, so Ellen says that I just started reading romance novels and I found myself sticking with certain authors more than I do with other genres. Do you think that my experience aligns with general trends for readers?
Yeah, it's a whole discussion about, you have basically, auto-buy authors. You see the author, you automatically buy that book. I can tell you I'm not going to turn my computer around because my office is a hot mess, but I have everything that Nora Roberts has ever written. And that's over 200 books, all of them in hard copy, in bookshelves. Ooh. I have, I follow authors. I've got, I'm very fond of Emma Hulley. I'm very fond of, Ilona Andrews and Patricia Briggs. So I think that author loyalty is really pretty common because you find somebody whose voice you vibe with and whose storytelling you really like, and you just sort of go with it.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's great about Romancelandia is that if you find other romance readers, they are super happy to give you recommendations. Like they want to share with you.
Yeah.
So if you tell me, hey, I really like the Ilona Andrews books, but I don't know where to go from here. Somebody will be like, okay, well, if you like that, try Nalini Singh. She's amazing. That kind of sort of recommendation culture that goes on, I think is fantastic for finding new authors because you do tend to stovepipe.
Yeah.
Right? Like you find an author you like, you glom everything that they've done, which with Laura Roberts is difficult, but you can do it. And you just sort of go from there. And so, yeah, I think that stovepiping is super common.
Okay. Yeah. From my perspective, not being a romance author, I'm more of a science fiction kind of guy. And what I found is I'm a little bit less attached to specific authors because, like, when I was younger, the stuff that I was reading was, like, part of franchises. So, like, I would read Star Wars Expanded Universe books all the time, or there's, like, Battletech out there, or all of these different, like, it's owned by a company that then hires out to different authors that might be in themselves big names in the genre of science fiction. But because you have that like variety built in, like I know who Michael Stackpole is, Timothy Zahn, all of these big names, with the exception, of course, of like Neil Stephenson, who is just a great science fiction writer and everyone should read him. But who knows? Who knows? So with that out of the way, let's talk about sex. Let's talk about writing good sex versus writing bad sex and why that really matters.
Oh, it super matters. Nothing throws people out of a story faster than a bad sex scene. So many people have had sex, and a lot of people have had bad sex, and a lot of people have had good sex. But writing a bad sex scene, and bad sex scenes have different sort of versions, but writing a bad sex scene just throws people out of the story. And so because of that, writing good sex scenes is super important because the entire idea is to keep that person, that reader in the story, sort of have them stay engaged. Anything that chucks you out of the story is never good. And badly written sex scenes do that. And that's a difference between a badly written sex scene and a scene that has bad sex in it. Like you can have an intentionally not satisfying sexual encounter that is well written.
Yeah.
And that's a very different thing than just a poorly written scene. And that's an important thing. And I think that's the first thing that has to happen when you're writing a sex scene is you have to ask yourself, why am I writing this scene? Is this scene important? Does it need to be here? Why does it need to be here? And that is the very first place to start, because if it doesn't need to be there, why are you writing it? Don't do it. It's never going to be good if it's not supposed to be there. It needs to serve some purpose in the story. Is that purpose plot development? Sure, could be. Is that purpose character development? Often. There are a lot of reasons you can have a sex scene in terms of story purpose, but there needs to be a purpose to the scene. If it's just extraneous, then your reader is going to be like, okay, but why? Why are we doing this? And that often leads to poorly written sex scenes because they're just sort of sticking out there in the middle of nowhere for no reason. So that's the very first thing is you need to know why you're writing that scene. And that will also inform the kind of scene you're writing. Are you writing the scene because there's a plot purpose and you need certain things out of it? If so, you have to think about what those things are and how to plan them into the scene. Is this about character development? Okay, well, what kind of character development? What does that look like? How does that need to fit into the scene? And so all of those things are things that you have to consider when you are writing the sex scene. And I think that one of the places, probably the most common place these things fail, is right there. You get sex scenes that are just written because they felt like they needed to put a sex scene there for some reason, and they just didn't bother to really put any effort into it. And that's going to make for a terrible read. So the second part of that then is, okay, so now you know why you need to write it. You have to figure out what the tone is that you're going for. Sex has so many moods. so sex can be, is this a scene where it's romantic and soft and just like sort of floaty, or is this a scene where it's intense and like really like visceral? All of those are going to be informed by what you need that scene to do in your story, and they're also going to be informed by how you want to convey that information for your story. All of that stuff is the stuff that's in the background. And then you come to the actually writing the scene. And here, the biggest thing I will tell people is, for pity's sake, know your anatomy. I cannot tell you how many times the worst sex scenes that you read are terrible sex scenes because the anatomy got just absolutely blown up in some way. There was actually a great thread on Twitter by the book queen last week, I think it was, where she was tweeting about a sex scene sex scenes in a couple of books she had read by the same author that had a similar thing. And it was just like, for example, at one point, and I'm not quoting this because she actually quoted this, but I'm sort of paraphrasing, that he was performing oral sex on this woman, and he sucked her entire vagina into his mouth, and we were all like, that's bad.
That's horrible. Yeah, you need a doctor.
Don't do that. That's bad.
Yeah.
And so like that kind of anatomy sort of thing is a thing to pay attention to. And that's a thing that in bad sex scenes happens all the time. This is, I think, one of those things that I often refer to this as the anime version of sex, like tentacle porn anime version of sex, where it's like like he rammed through her cervix. No. That requires medical attention. Yeah. That is bad. Anything like that where there's like an anatomical issue is going to throw people right out of the scene if they have any real knowledge of what's going on. And it's just going to be like, and every person with a uterus is going to cross their legs and go, oh, and it's not going to be good. I
saw a similar thread on Twitter actually last week of someone actually doing the homework and asking, hey men, question, would you ever use shampoo as lube when you're masturbating? And the response was a swift and solid, absolutely not. Things get into the urethra and it's painful. And then after that, like all of the replies were other examples of like, one person was like, yeah, I remember reading someone wrote like using a bar of soap as a dildo. And it's like, no, these people maybe need to learn a bit more about how things go before they start.
It's never bad to ask a question, right? Yes. Like that's exactly the thing is you go to Twitter or you go wherever and you're like, okay, help me.
Yes, exactly.
Help me. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times that I have gone to my husband and gone, okay, so I don't have a penis, so I need you to tell me this thing.
Yeah.
Help me, right? And that's like knowing that you need to ask that is super important. But the anatomy stuff is absolutely critical because not having the anatomy right makes for terrible sex scenes.
Yeah.
Really, really terrible.
Yeah.
There's a whole big discussion that happens in Romancelandia all the time about virginity and where the hymen is located. Because there are approximately 1/4 of a gajillion romance novels in which the virgin heroine is deflowered, but he's already like halfway in before he hits her hymen. And it's like, that is not how that works. That's just not how that works. So yeah, the anatomy is super important. And it's one of those basic things that I think a lot of people think they know, but they don't. And I recommend, and I saw that she retweeted it, I recommend Sexplanations for everyone. It's really good.
Absolutely.
You should go watch them.
Yeah.
All explanation videos are fantastic. Dr. Doe does a fabulous job.
Yeah. Shout out to the aspiring authors in the audience if you want to learn, or just really anyone, if you want to know more about human anatomy and sexual anatomy and the reproductive systems, which are also pleasure systems. Let's just keep that in mind. You can go to youtube.com/sexplanations. That is a channel by my dear friend, Lindsay Doe, and there's a video for everything. You will learn so much about your own body, about other people's bodies, and it's a great starting place. So thanks for bringing her up, Elise.
Well, no, I mean, it's fantastic because all of those pieces of information are really useful.
Yeah.
Sort of side note on that, Romancelandia is generally really helpful. So if you are an aspiring romance novel, follow some of your favorite authors and follow smaller authors and actually try talking to them. In a lot of cases, as long as you're not like super obnoxious about like, who is your agent and tell me how to contact them. No, but if it's like craft questions and general questions and stuff like that, you can learn a lot from your fellow authors. Yeah. So, but to get back to writing sex scenes. So now we've gotten why we're writing it, the tone, and gotten our general anatomy. I try to explain it to people like this. Think about it like writing a fight scene in the sense that you need to have the choreography right. And in some ways, the choreography is much more complicated than a fight scene because you have to get people's clothes off or out of the way. You have to move things around. You have to consider how they're going to access those pleasure points and create pleasure for their partners. You have to think about all of the furniture in the room and the setting that you're in. You have to think about all of those things and how to choreograph your action around that because you have a specific set of things you're going to try and accomplish in this. Like if your sex scene is going for penetration, then that's one set of things you're trying to accomplish. If your sex scene is going for mutual masturbation, that's a different thing. You've got whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish, you have to sort of think about how you're going to choreograph that in a space and make sure that works and happens. So the choreography is kind of like writing a fight scene. You have to think about how that's going to work because it's one of the things that makes a bad sex scene is you're halfway in the sex scene and they're like, okay, so he goes to enter and you're like, wait, I thought they were still wearing clothes. I don't understand. Like anything that pulls you out is bad. So you have to think about the choreography and making sure that the choreography works. And then layered on top of the choreography, you have to think about the emotional choreography that's going on. And you have to think about whether or not the physical and emotional choreography work together to create the level of intimacy you're going for. I saw one of the most valuable things about writing a sort of escalation of intimacy that I think I have ever run into was a thing that Linda Howard did. And Linda Howard has all kinds of problems, but in this particular case, I think she's exactly right on. About the escalation of intimacy and how when you first see somebody, like when there's eye contact. It's like, so you've got eye to body contact. You're looking at their body. And then you have eye to eye contact, which is actually more intimate than eye to body contact, right? So you're sort of stepping that up. And then you've got voice to voice when you're talking. And then you've got like hand to arm or to, some sort of, extremity. And then as you get, shoulder is more intimate than your arm. So there's this like tracking sort of thing. And I actually have it on a whiteboard in my office all the time. And it's like eye to body, eye to eye, voice to voice, arm around the waist, and then hand to head. And this is something I never thought about, but having somebody touch your face or head is much more intimate than having them touch even like your butt. And that sort of tracking of how the intimacy works should inform you in terms of how you are writing things and what their level of intimacy is at that moment. You can subvert those norms if you know why you're doing that. And sometimes you do that specifically for the shock value, right? Like if you have an intimate scene with people who are doing, say, for example, a hookup, right? They might never kiss, right? They might just go to straight up intercourse. You might never have any of the sort of more intimate things. They might never touch each other's faces, even though you have genital contact. And that tells you something about the intimacy of the scene and how things are progressing. And that in and of itself is something that you need to think about as an author is how do I want to portray their level of connection? And how am I doing that physically in the scene? if you think about the level of intimacy of certain sex acts, like, so for example, let's say that we're talking about a same-sex couple, right? Oral sex is going to be more intimate than hand to genital contact, right? That's just going to be the way that is. But you may have them completely skip all penetration. They may not engage in penetration at all. Same-sex couple or mixed sex couple, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You may have a couple that does not engage in penetration at all. This is more common in same-sex pairings than it is in heterosexual pairings, but it happens everywhere. And so that kind of skipping around, you have to say, okay, well, if I'm going to try to convey intimacy without using the same physical landmarks I might use in a different couple, how am I going to do that?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of thought that goes into that.
Oh, yeah.
And then we get to the last stuff, which is the word choice, which is, I think, what people think about when they're thinking about how to write a sex scene.
Yeah.
And the idea of like purple prose and talking about throbbing members.
Yeah, throbbing members, whatever. I was going to say.
Which is very much sort of purple prose that people associate with romance, which is very much something that happened in the 80s, particularly because, again, the societal constraints were like, you didn't say penis, you didn't say cock, you didn't say dick, you said throbbing member because you couldn't directly reference it, or his, his stiffness or whatever,
his manhood,
and her the dampness between her thighs or whatever it was. It's like, and now we have progressed to a point where I think readers expect that you will use appropriate terminology for whatever is happening. So if you have a couple or a threesome or whoever, and they're engaging in an act, I think readers expect you to actually talk about what's happening. And so the purple prose has become very much a thing of ridicule, because readers, it's a difference in expectation from the readers, I think, and that progression over time. And so now you have to think about word choice. And I think I told you in an email, like, there's a difference in concept in terms of, if you are talking about a character and you reference, that character's boobs, that conveys a different sort of message than talking about that character's tits.
Yeah.
Versus talking about that character's breasts. Like, those have different connotations.
Yeah.
And so you have to think about what you're trying to convey. So are you going to talk about this person's penis or their dick or their cock or what? Those word choices carry weight.
Yeah.
And then you have to cross that with the idea that you have repetition problems, because there's only so many things you can say about a specific thing.
Yeah.
And so that becomes really difficult when you're writing a sex scene. Repetition is the worst problem for me for writing a sex scene. So I will often write one through and not worry about repetition. And then I'll go back and be like, okay, how do I fix this? Right, like, highlight, how many times did I say the word dick? How many times did I say cock? How did this work? And then I can go through and sort of rework things so that you're not saying the same word 6 times in a paragraph.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's kind of how I think about it, is think about why you're writing it, think about how you're going to write it, sort of plan it through as the choreography, write the thing in layers of physical and emotional contact, go back through thinking about word choice and repetition.
Yeah.
And then at the end of that, you should have something that's pretty good, and have somebody else read it so that it doesn't, read it out loud to yourself. Read it out loud to yourself, because sometimes you'll be like, wait, what did I just say? And then it'll click for you. Yeah. So that would be what I'd say on that.
Yeah, it sounds to me like it's very much along the similar vein, or kind of keeping in mind the idea of, like, there's a difference between having sex and making love and fucking, and, like, each of those 3 things can face something different. And then, like, as someone who's queer, like, I think of sex differently depending on the gender of my partner. I am more likely to use, like, the word cock when I'm talking to a male partner, for example. than I would with a female partner. And exactly like you said, like the things that you do with partners of different genders and different sexes is just different. And yeah, so I guess keeping that reality to it is very important and really, really makes a difference.
Right. Like we were talking about one, I was talking about one with another author the other day, and it was a sci-fi piece, and every single sex scene, every time, the author referred to the hero's alien cock. Every time. Alien cock, alien cock, alien cock. And it's like, I mean, that's both repetitive and annoying. Because it's like, okay, now I need to know why it's alien. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Explain this to me. You have now just directed my attention to this. Why? Like, you have made this a point. Now I need to know why you've made this a point. And so that's a thing that you have to sort of think about when you're writing any kind of sex scene. And the choreography thing gets way more complicated when you add more bodies.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Right. So like choreographing, and for the one that you read, right, Twice as High, which I had aliens, and they were winged aliens with actual wings. So now we have extra appendages that get in the way. And it's like, okay, wait, how is this going to work? I don't understand. And you'll see on Romancelandia, you've got romance authors, you have Barbie dolls they use to sort of map things out.
Oh, yeah.
I actually think that like artist mannequins, which have better jointing and like better proportions and stuff, because Barbie dolls are not exactly the same proportions as human beings.
Yeah.
So, all of that. And it's really very interesting to me how different authors approach things. But I think that those are the basic building blocks of how to write a good sex scene. And if you don't have, you can have bad sex scenes that take into account those things, but I think it's really hard to have a really egregiously awful sex scene if you really think about those pieces of it. That makes sense.
Yeah. Like, I think it sounds like as long as you keep in mind the players, as it were, the actions, like the choreography, what parts go together, and then also like the emotional tone or the context of the sex scene. It sounds like these are the cool. There is somebody in the chat who is calling themselves the Triumphant Fool, and their question is: are there any lessons from there that may not be immediately obvious? I'm waiting to see if there's any clarification on that question. Other than that, anyone else have questions?
Lessons from where?
Yeah, that's my question. Like, I guess, one thing that I think is perhaps worth talking about is when you're talking about sex scenes and you're talking about the folks who are reading sex scenes, I think that does set up expectations for how sex in real life goes. So, like...
Well, this gets back to a thing that I think is an important distinction between earlier romance novels and romance today, which is the discussion around consent. And how explicit do you need to be with consent to model appropriate behavior in the books? This was a whole discussion that was also had in Romancelandia about how explicit do you need to be about talking about birth control and the use of condoms. How explicit do you need to be with those like real world modeling behaviors when you're writing? And in a lot of cases, like some authors will take it, they'll be explicit about it the first time and sort of not explicit about it afterwards. Like, we've done this explicitly, we're implying it happens every other time. Consent is a dodgy thing in Romancelandia because there is an entire subgenre of romance that is built around, it's called dubcon, and it's built around dubious consent. And it is very specifically fantasy. And the authors are like, this is not real life, this is fantasy, this is not how reality should work. And there's a lot around that. And I don't so much write dubcons, so that's not really something I can speak to. I try to make consent clear, but not like so distracting that it takes you out of the story.
Yeah, you're not clubbing people over the head with it.
Right, but you can make consent very, very sexy, and you can make it very sexy by having your characters in a scene, having them in in the sex scene, and have one of the partners be specific and say something along the lines of, I really, like, let's say that you have a same-sex male couple, right? Consent is super important in this context because certain partners may not, I mean, you don't want to do any action without checking first.
Yeah, yeah.
So you might have a character who says, I really want to get inside you. Can I get inside you? That can be really sexy in the context of the scene.
Yeah.
Or you can have consent be something like a character holding up a bottle of lube and saying, are we ready for me to use this on you? Yeah. That explicit consent, but in the context of the scene, isn't sort of like taking a step back going, excuse me, do you consent to my having sex with you? Cool, let's go. So there's different ways you can handle consent in that context.
Yeah, and I think that's a great thing to bring up, because like that's one of the things where you have an overlap between the romance writing as a genre and porn. The idea of dubcon, of dubious consent, like at the end of the day, a lot of people watch porn because they want to be entertained, or they want a very specific thing from it. And I think it's, important to keep in mind that like they're actors, and they have figured these things out before they start the scene. I'm glad to hear that like authors also have a similar mind, and similar things on their mind.
I think I know that porn does this thing, which I think is brilliant, that they often at the beginning of the piece of film or piece of media, they will put a thing in that says, these are the actors.
Actors are 18.
All actors are over 18 and they've agreed to the contents of this scene or whatever it is. Yeah. And that is their explicit consent, right? They are saying, we are explicitly consenting to this. I think it gets, one of the places where things get murky is when you're talking about kink in romance. And how explicit do you have to be about things like the use of safe words and what contracts look like and stuff like this. And I think things like 50 Shades of Grey really threw this into relief, because 50 Shades of Grey is not, generally speaking, considered much of a romance, because it's got all kinds of strange other things going on that don't really fit into the romance genre. Although I guess technically the series is a romance because it does end in a happy for now, happy ever after. So, there's that. But you have the whole thing around how consent was dealt with, and there was this contract, but he ignored it, and all of this sort of thing. And it brought up a whole lot of conversation in this sort of, in the community of Romancelandia that writes kink romance. Yeah. And it's good conversation to have, because you do need to think about how do you want to present those things in your story. Yeah. Because you don't want to promote terrible behavior.
No, and it's especially tricky with the realm of kink, because like I have a lot of friends in the kink scene. I have been kind of parallel or adjacent to it. And I know that like while lots of people get it right, there are oftentimes situations where it does not go right at all. And I guess that kind of goes back to the idea of the importance of making things explicit and the importance of modeling like good behavior, as it were, in writing and other media that we consume. Because like if you have somebody who's going and thinking like they just read 50 Shades of Grey for the first time, they've never been exposed to kink before, and they read that and they're like, choke me, daddy. How do I get this to work for me? And then they go and they explicitly find it. They might end up in a situation with a bad actor who is kinky, but also who doesn't really understand that even in good kink communities, you have consent, and you have it sorted out.
There is a difference between kink and abuse.
Exactly.
And that's the thing you have to figure out. There's a fantastic book. Shucks, who's the author? I've got it on my bookshelf, called BDSM 101 that I read before I wrote any kink, because I needed a better understanding. Research is your friend in writing. In all contexts of writing, research is your friend. Yeah. And it was really great because it gave like explicit discussions of aftercare and contracts and how safe words work and how the variation in that and what consent can look like or not look like, and in terms of variations and where the lines that are red flags are.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic book. I'm going to get off the screen for just a second.
Yeah,
Really good.
Really good. Yeah, so for those of you who are perhaps just joining us, we have gotten to the meat and potatoes of this discussion. We are talking about how to write sexy scenes with Elise Logan, a romance novelist and just general human who's really good.
It's called SM 101 by Jay Wiseman.
Excellent.
It's a realistic introduction. It's really good.
Yeah. While we're talking about books and book recommendations, I can't grab it because I don't want to go off screen. And I already moved all of my books because we're in the middle of moving house. But there is a book out there called How Sex Works, which talks about and it's by a doctor, and it talks about sex in humans and then the various parallels in animals and how genetics and stuff like that work, which is really cool. The doctor's first name is Sharon, like Sharon, but Sharon, and I can't remember last name. And then there's another one. If this is a thing that you're interested in to protect your own health, there's a book called Anal Health and Pleasure. So that would be worth looking up as well. Because things can go wrong if you don't know what you're doing. So
yeah, they can.
Do your research.
So yeah, research is your friend.
Yeah.
It goes back to that anatomy question, right? Research of all contexts is really good for making sure that your sex scenes don't go where you don't want them to go.
Yeah.
You have to know the parameters you're working with, and then you can make it work. And knowing if you're going to write kink of whatever variety, you need to do some research in that kink so that you understand what's going on with that. And if that research is your own personal experience, cool, that works. If, however, you're writing outside of your personal experience, research becomes a valuable tool.
Yeah. Yeah. And it might not even hurt, even if you have personal experience, to consider just doing some research for fun, because, everybody has different experiences. What works for me might not work for you. And it never hurts to get a big, diverse pool of opinions and views. So
yeah, I mean, sex is one of those things that has so much variety and there's so much variation that people are absolutely going to have different experiences with it.
Yeah. So the Triumphant Fool got back to us and he said, well, there might be some obvious challenges to writing a same-sex scene, for example, such as differentiating whose genitalia you're talking about. But I'm curious if there may have been less challenges, which I think we just talked about. So I feel like that worked out pretty well.
No, I mean, that's an excellent point about determining who's doing what in any various scene. Again, with menages, this becomes very, very difficult because you can't just use the characters' names over and over. But if you have, you'll have, two people who are the same gender and one person who's different. So even if you're using pronouns, you can't do that. It just becomes very complicated and difficult. And it goes back to that editing process of the scene where I just write it through and then I go back and try and fix it because some of it you're just not going to get when you write it through the first time. That editing process is super important, which goes back to something I said earlier in our call, which is editors are vital to any writing. They're absolutely vital. You need a good editor.
Cool. Well, just to be mindful of time, we are at 2:19. We've been talking for about an hour and a quarter, which I've been having a blast. But let's if anyone else has any questions, you can find Elise on Twitter at Elise Logan. Let me see if I can do this. I think I can make this appear on the screen. You won't be able to see it, but I think let's see. Let's go to properties. So
the funny thing about that is if you do a search for me on Twitter, that's not what comes up. In fact, romance isn't what comes up at all. My day job, political science thing comes up.
Oh, really?
And I'm so mad about it because I had a tweet that went viral, actually viral, and I misspelled millennials in it.
Oh, so it goes.
So annoying.
Do you have a Twitter handle you would prefer out there?
Yeah. You can't edit it. It's very annoying.
All right, so I think there. Oh, I gotta move that. There. Oh, that's so small. Bigger. Well, anyways, at Elise Logan. We'll just say at Elise Logan. So one with
Yeah.
that. Um, Otherwise, yeah, I think that's about it. Thank you so much for being willing to come and talk about your craft and your genre. Um,
So super
and
fun.
yeah, yeah, I'll have to check out Menage on 34th Street and see what else is out there. Um, but yeah, all right.
Actually, for you, because you like sci-fi,
Mm-hmm.
I recommend Nora Roberts' J.D. Robb stuff for you.
Oh, JD, I have heard of JD Robb. It's quite a popular one with the folks that come in. I will have to let me write. I'm going to put that in the chat. JD, is all of JD Robb science fiction stuff, or just like
Yep.
okay,
Yeah,
cool,
that is Nora Roberts' science fiction pen name.
nice, nice, awesome. Well, folks in the chat are saying thank you as well. So, everybody, it's been. Let me just flip over to me real quick. It's been a pleasure. Thank you all for coming. I don't have an author lined up for next week, but if you know someone or if you are an author, let me know. And we will see them later. And until next time, thanks for watching, and don't forget to ask questions.